Hey everyone, it's Sharon. So I've been talking about developmental disabilities, and today I want to talk about autism disorder. And I had a question come in about how do you know if they've got autism or trauma? So I want to address that as well. All right, so let me share my screen. All right. So you should be able to see my slides now. All right. So autism spectrum disorder. As you know, it is now considered a spectrum because it is on a line, basically. Uh, People with autism are not just one way or another way. It is one of these disorders that has lots of symptoms, and you can have many of the symptoms, you can have only a few of the symptoms. So this spectrum disorder covers all of it. Asperger's as well as autism, different levels of autism, all of those different things. So first of all, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning that it is something in the brain. Um, excuse me. So it is a disorder that affects the brain and how the brain functions. It especially affects the areas that deal with communication and social interaction. So that's where we really see children with autism or adults with autism as well. They will have those main disabilities. You can be verbal, nonverbal. It can affect the ability of self-care and some of their intellectual abilities, but a lot of times it does not. And so to say that somebody with autism is less smart or smarter, we have seen those instances where somebody with autism actually is brighter than their peers. Um, Again, it is a spectrum. So it cannot, you just have to kind of be able to pinpoint. Generally, autism will be evident before the age of 3. It can be diagnosed later because, especially if they were what we call high functioning, you may not notice it. But generally, you'll start to notice because it is a brain disorder. It is going to be starting when the brain develops. And if you've seen my one on brain development, our brain's development, really by the age of 3, a lot of our main senses are developed, and that is what autism really affects. So common symptoms and behaviors, challenges with social skills and communication, those are the main ones you're always going to see. There may be repetitive behaviors. They might be more or less sensitive to sensory input. So a lot of children who are on the spectrum do not like a lot of loud noises, bright lights. You'll see kids going around with those big covered headphones. That is fantastic for anybody who has sensory issues. Sometimes they're less sensitive. So you'll see the ones who kind of gaze off into space, and you could be saying their name 7 times. And they're not aware of their environment. They're not even really in the environment. Their brain is engaged somewhere elsewhere. So you will have that as well. So here's where it becomes tricky. Autism, more than any other developmental disorder, overlaps and or mimics trauma. So let me show you what I'm talking about. They're both behavior diagnoses. So that's a big thing. So while we know that autism is a brain disorder, there really isn't a way to diagnose it by looking at the brain. Like they can't just look at the brain and say, oh, this child's going to have autism. So it is always diagnosed based on behavior. Trauma is the same way. So trauma can affect the brain. We've seen that. But again, they can't look at the brain. We don't have that technology to look at the brain and say, oh, this child has trauma. And so therefore, we have to, again, go based on the behaviors. So you can see how these behaviors overlap. The social parts of autism, where they don't have that social emotional, what they call reciprocity. I can't say that name or that word, but basically where they can read other emotions or express emotions on their own. That mimics that social withdrawal. So both those with ASD and with PTSD will be not show interest in their peers. They're not going to be able to show emotions. Partly, if they're have ASD, it's because they just don't have that section of their brain developed. If they have trauma, it's because they are trying to, or they're because they're suppressing emotions, or because they haven't experienced much positive emotion, so they don't know what that means. Um, Repetitive play. Both children with autism and children with trauma like routines because they like predictability. They like consistency. It gives them something to anticipate without fear. So you'll see a lot of repetitive play, a need for routines, all of those things. Um, the outbursts, a lot of you who have joined this group have talked about your children's outbursts. Again, trauma is will be the reason for those outbursts in a child with trauma. Those with ASD, it's because they don't want to change. They have an inflexibility. They can't pivot. We use that word, we pivot when we have to do something different. Something goes wrong and we pivot and we do something different. They can't do that. That's not how their brain works. And so they may have an outburst when they're being asked to do something they cannot physically do. So I really cannot talk today. Sleep difficulties. Those with ASD will have some problems with sleep. But it's partly just their makeup. I've seen children with autism who just don't need that much sleep, or they're so hyper fixated on something that they want to complete it before they can sleep. Those with trauma, their sleep is going to be more because of nightmares. They may have some regression, so they are wetting the bed, things like that. So it's a very different reason why they're having sleep difficulty. And this is important when we start talking about how do we manage behaviors then of the two. So it's very important to know trauma can be healed. Autism cannot. And I should say, autism does not need to be healed. Autism is the way the child is born. Trauma is something that has happened to the child. It has affected their brain and it has affected it temporarily. And if you go back to my tips from the last month on creating a sense of safety and all of that in the home, you can see where we talk about the fact that trauma is healable. Trauma is usually treated with therapies, so like cognitive behavior therapy, which is a lot of what I talk about. All of the tips that I give are really CBT based. But basically, trauma is where children learn to review their behavioral responses and then attempt to make changes for the long term. CBT can actually heighten a child with autism's behaviors because a child with autism, their brain is designed for the moment. That's why they're so stuck in those routines, because they are just living in that moment. And if you try and push them to think about how to review their behavior and change, that inflexibility is going to kick in and they are going to have more anxiety. And it's going to trigger them and cause more behaviors that may be unmanageable. So, first thing for anybody who has a child with autism behaviors, or has autism, I should say, is that we need to accept the child the way they are. And again, I want to really stress this. There is a whole movement. It's not as active now. I think a lot of attention has been drawn to the fallacies, but there was a whole movement of, we can do this and we can cure children with autism. Do this and we'll cure autism. Autism isn't curable and it doesn't need to be. This is how the child is born. It's frustrating for us if we don't understand because we can't get into their brain. And that can be incredibly frustrating. But It is the way that they're born, and we've got to accept that. And once we can accept that this is who they are, then the next step is not managing their behaviors, it's managing our own. It's managing our own responses. So even with children with trauma, I have said this a lot of times, we are the ones that are triggering the behaviors because we are responding in a way that's negative. So that's why I really push these positive responses, ways that we can create a sense of safety, a sense of connection, sense of love and belonging, because they are responding to us. And if we can't adjust our own behaviors, we're not going to be able to help them. So really, the first thing we have to do in order to manage autism behaviors is to really understand them. So doing some reading, and I should have looked this up, I will drop it in the chat. There is a book that came out and that I've read, and it is really good. It's written by a young man who has autism. It took him several years to write this book because he is nonverbal. Doesn't mean he can't communicate, but it did take him a long time to write the book in order to be able to express himself. So writing for a child with autism is actually very difficult, but he kind of overcame that. And it's a really interesting book because it talks about being autistic from his point of view. I've also noticed that there are lots of websites now that are being written by children and adults with autism that talk about their point of view. So those are things to look at, is trying to understand them from the inside out and knowing that your own child cannot always communicate the way that we think they should. So really adjusting our own thinking and understanding so that we can help them then express themselves in a way that we can communicate with each other.